Jeffrey, are you comfortable having me record this interview, excuse me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is an interview. I'm going to introduce you to a friend, Jeffrey Selchick. Jeffrey and I have known each other. Jeff, I was thinking almost 50 years now. Was it 1975 we first met?
75 is exactly right, and
Yeah.
that's almost 50 years ago.
Makes two guys think here. Okay, a long time. Jeffrey and I both got started together, young professionals at State University of New York. Jeffrey went on to become a very well-known labor and employment arbitrator for now more than 4 decades. He's reviewed thousands of investigations when deciding cases and is a member of the National Academy of Arbitrators. I thought it would really be important to hear from someone like Jeffrey because as students, we're learning how to evaluate the work that we do. On the other hand, evaluation of our work is going to go way beyond what we can learn and what we can apply to our own cases. There are going to be times when information you've collected and preserved is going to be evaluated by a hearing officer. Could be a labor arbitrator, an employment arbitrator, could be a hearing officer at EEOC, but they're very often going to look at very similar kinds of issues. And so what I thought I would do is ask Jeffrey to respond to some questions. By the way, he sent me in advance, just so you're aware, a series of issues he thought were problems when he was reviewing workplace investigations. What I've done is create some questions based on those that relate to our class. Jeffrey, is there anything you want to say at this point before we begin?
Yeah, Anton, it's a privilege, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you and your students. You know, one of the hallmarks of your career is that you've always imparted practical knowledge to your students, and that's really what I'm interested in giving them today. Some practical real-life knowledge, not just theories, but actual examples of what works and what doesn't work. I think that practical experience is almost the best type of experience. You learn by doing, and one of the things I've always enjoyed about your teaching career is that you've strived to give your students that practical real-life experience based on your own experience doing investigations and speaking to people like myself who are immersed in it for decades. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I enjoy talking with you as always.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Okay, I'll start with a question. I'm going to, interestingly, take off my glasses when I read these because I'm getting some glare here. One of the important themes of the course this semester, Jeffrey, has been 3 values: speed, thoroughness, and objectivity. In anticipation of this interview, you identified the most common mistakes that workplace investigators make. In some ways, each seems related to one of these 3 values. Based on your experience, is there any one value that seems most important when you evaluate the quality of investigations you review as an arbitrator?
Well, you've hit the big 3, but what I think is most relevant is that thoroughness is the absolute key. But thoroughness is often influenced by the other 2 criteria, speed and objectivity. You cannot be thorough if you rush the investigation. So there's where speed comes in. And you cannot be thorough if you've already predetermined the conclusion based on either your bias or your emotions or your simple lack of objectivity. You have to, as an investigator, do your best to put aside bias and prejudice and not prejudge what happened. This is one of the key mistakes that investigators make. They prejudge what occurred. You cannot make a conclusion and then seek the evidence to support it. Rather, you must obtain the evidence, which will naturally lead you to a conclusion. You can't put the horse before the cart. You have to get the evidence first before you reach a conclusion. So I like the fact, I'm a big fan of written statements. I think that when you look at thoroughness, written statements are critical. And if you take a written statement, it must be signed and dated. I prefer a written statement that's written by the witness themselves. Let them write what happened rather than having the investigator interpret their words. You know, it's like the old game telephone. When you hear something, it doesn't always come up exactly the same. Yeah. I like the people's words themselves. The absence of written statements leads to varying versions by the time you get to a hearing. Recollections of faint. People have a lot going on in their lives. They forget details. And if you wait too long, their recollections are often at odds with each other, often at odds with the facts. And what happens is credibility suffers. And the other thing that I think that's important when you look at what are the key elements, if you, as an investigator, don't be afraid to change your theory of the case as the investigation unfolds. Don't be wedded to one simple conclusion. You may discover things that change your whole view of where this investigation is going. Remember, this is not about the investigator being right. You don't have to be right. What your job is to do is first find the facts and hopefully the truth of what occurred. And your theory of the case will unfold as the investigation unfolds. This is not about you being right. This is about finding the truth of what occurred. Remember, allegations are not always proven. Sometimes they end up being just that, mere allegations not based on fact. So if you want to go back to the beginning, absolutely thoroughness is key, but you can't be thorough if you rush the investigation, and you can't be thorough if you prejudge it based on your own bias or prejudice. Take your time, let the investigation unfold, and it will usually take you to the right answer.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey. Excuse me. One of the issues you raised as a common mistake was an investigator's failure to develop an investigative plan at the outset of the investigation. In that context, what are the types of issues you notice that investigators ordinarily fail to consider?
Well, you know, Anton, one of, and I speak to you now as someone with a lot of experience who has grown up with technology, because of course it didn't exist when we first came into this business. But one of the problems with our fast email response technology is that we rarely take time to plan and consider our options. You know, taking time to think is really underrated. Sometimes we react too quickly. So what I like to say is, first, as you get an investigation on your desk, your first question should be, how do I approach this investigation? What should I do first? I need a plan. And the plan almost always should begin with the time-renowned basic questions. Who, what, where, when, and how. Those things never have changed. There's still essential aspects of an investigation. So how to proceed in terms of what to do first? Well, if relevant, and it's a physical evidence scene, you want to view the scene. You want to secure physical evidence. You want to obtain any video and audio if it exists, if it's relevant. You want to gather documents. You want to sit down and decide who you need to interview, and you want to decide in what order you'd like to interview. And that could be very important to how the facts of the matter unfold. It depends on the nature of the investigation. For instance, is this an incident that just happened and you just became aware of it? Or is it something that's been ongoing and represents a pattern and is only now reported, but may concern something that happened months or even longer ago? So you got to consider the fact also that when you talk to witnesses, people talk, people gossip, it's natural, they exchange views. So you want to, it's important sometimes to interview your witnesses quickly before they had a chance to get together and get their stories aligned. If possible, I'd rather you don't allow them to converse with each other before you interview them, but that's sometimes very difficult. But the longer you wait to speak to witnesses, the less accurate and credible they will be. And by the way, one of the tenets of being a good investigator is to maintain confidentiality. You yourself have to avoid gossip and rumor and talking. You have to keep your own counsel sometimes and not disclose what you've learned, because that's prejudging the case. Remember, do not suggest the answers to the witnesses. Let them tell the story. Let them tell you what happens. Sometimes an investigator is so involved in the case that they impose their own view on the witnesses and suggest what might have happened. You have to try to keep your emotions out of it. And that's very difficult, but sometimes it's a very emotional aspect to the investigation, but you have to learn to control your emotion.
Jeffrey, you know, it's interesting. You've mentioned, you know, being careful not to suggest answers. we, a couple weeks ago, spent a great deal of time talking about slicing the bologna, which you may recall as being a basic cognitive interviewing technique that we developed years ago. I mean, you and I were working together when we put that process together. And very important, I think, for people to realize just what you said. If you use that process, you're not suggesting what people should say. You're giving them an opportunity to tell you what they remember and help them remember. So I really appreciate your mentioning that and reinforcing that concept.
Well, just one other point, it's very hard to ask, people underestimate how hard it is to ask a direct question.
Mhm.
It's very easy to have a leading question, but if you go back to the basics, who, what, where,
Yeah.
when, how, and you keep
Mhm.
following those basics, you will get a more truthful and credible
Yeah.
version of what happened. You have to decide to keep your own thoughts out of it and let the witness speak. You'd be amazed what people will tell you if you just let them talk.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Can you give one or two examples of situations where the beginning of investigation was not timely, it was delayed in some way? How did the delay compromise the case you had to decide?
Well, the most flagrant example, I think, involves physical abuse of any type of a resident or a coworker. The delay is fatal in terms of documenting injuries and getting a timely medical exam and review. Any physical altercation requires immediate action by the investigator. The same goes for physical damage to property. It must be timely. If the condition of a person or the damage of property is involved, it's not of value to show me as the arbitrator what it looks like weeks later. That's not of value. You can't show me this is what you think it looked like at the time. I need to see what it looked like at the time. And the only way you're going to get that is by acting quickly if it's that type of an incident. Example, vehicle accidents come to mind, as do cases of abuse and physical altercations. Sexual abuse is a good example. It requires an immediate physical exam so that you can corroborate the version of events. Sexual harassment, racial discrimination, gender discrimination, workplace violence are great examples of where you need timely investigative work, particularly where there are verbal interactions, because words matter. In most of those cases, it's the words that drive the case. Waiting too long, again, to take a statement from a witness is often fatal because memories of details quickly fade. A witness who is unsure what was said when the offense is in fact the words can result in failure of the case. And oftentimes, the other thing to remember, people change, people are gone, people leave, people move on. Key witnesses often disappear. I've had many cases where months later, when you look for the key witness, they're gone, or they have no interest in providing information. Or sometimes, unfortunately, they've been intimidated by their peers and no longer want to cooperate with you or no longer want to tell the truth. So these are all things that can be fatal if you delay too long. But most importantly are the things like a physical examination. If you allege that someone was smacked in the face and you say they had a giant bruise, but the picture you show me is months later when there is no bruise, where does that leave me? That leaves me with people's versions of what the bruise looked like.
Yeah.
And that is often not helpful.
Actually, Jeff, that gets us right into the next question. And in this question, if you don't raise it, I'm going to raise a case that you used to talk about in the early 80s that I've never forgotten. But let's go with the question first.
Well, that's assuming that I remember the late 80s, but okay, you're a
Okay, well, the early 80s. Now, often when I teach this subject, students suggest that issues related to the proper collection and preservation of physical evidence are generally related to criminal investigations. To what extent has physical evidence been important in cases you've handled?
Well, I think the best example is the video evidence that we now see in many incidents. Particularly, I do a great number of police excessive force cases, and as we've all seen, the video becomes the key piece of evidence. So I look at video as physical evidence, and that's some of the most important evidence we see today. But you have to gather all of it, not just parts of it. I had a very, very controversial case recently, a police case where the public only saw, 30 seconds of the video. I got to see 4 hours of the video, and it changed the whole view of the case. Emails and text messages are critical. If you don't get them, they could be gone. It's not of value to tell me what you saw. It's of value to show me the document or show me the email. A great example is a case I had recently involving a correction officer who claimed to be injured during an altercation with an incarcerated individual. There was video of the event, but somehow the video disappeared. So all we were left with were different recollections by people, and they were all different. It didn't carry the day. I think the example that you're talking about is, I believe, there was an incident where a resident was hit with a board. Was that the case?
2x4. You got it, man. You're right. Yeah.
A resident claimed to be hit by a 2x4, and by the time we got to the case, someone brought in a board, and I said, the key question, is that the board that was used? No, that's a board just like the one that was used. Well, that's not acceptable. Sometimes demonstrable evidence, which is what that would be called, is useful, but it's not as good as the actual physical evidence. And I think another good example, is damage to property. So if you want to allege damage to property, but you show me a picture of it weeks later, after the property has been repaired, it's of no value to me. It's not the same as showing me what it looked like at the time. I'll give you another example. I had many cases of harassment involving the posters in locker rooms that are derogatory and either have some sort of a racial concept or a gender discrimination concept. But you don't show me the poster, and you show me what you think the poster was like. That doesn't carry the day. I need to see the actual poster. Another example, I had a case involving an employee who was claimed and alleged to have forged a document, but the document no longer exists. So how can I see if the document was forged? Claiming that an employee defaced or destroyed an item, but no photo was taken, is missing. It's a problem. I'll give you another example. We have a lot of cases about what people put on Facebook. People cite things on Facebook. I have so many Facebook cases, and all I could say is, be careful what you post on Facebook. But if the Facebook entry is gone, all that's left is you telling me what you think it said. That's not the same as me seeing what it said, because I guarantee you the other side will deny that's what it said. Another example is a case where a resident was alleged being punched, but there was no physical exam. So the resident says, I have black and blue marks, but there's no photos to support that. So we're left with the resident's word. And finally, drug cases is another one. If the drugs are gone, so is the case. Imagination is not evidence. Don't tell me to imagine what it looked like. Show me what it looked like.
Very good. Thank you, Jeffrey. And you got that 2x4 correct. I always use that when I'm doing training, the management training we're still doing these days, as an example of having the thing itself rather than something like the thing itself. So
absolutely. I can't believe I remembered that, but even a broken clock is right twice.
What, twice a day? Is that right? I guess if it's a military clock, once a day, I guess.
That's correct.
All right, number 5. I recall from my own experience as an investigator, there was often public and supervisory pressure to not only conclude the investigation quickly, but sometimes to conclude it in a certain way. What advice can you give to students that would help them learn to cope with that type of interference?
This is very difficult because oftentimes the investigator is being pressured by someone in authority or someone in a position of power or a supervisor, and it's very difficult. And they say to you, hurry up, I want to get to the end of this. That's where you return to your plan or your template for the investigation. You have to try to resist the pressure. You have to try to resist making a conclusion before you are done. Because once you give that conclusion and it goes public, it's very difficult to retreat or modify the conclusion. An investigator should try his best or her best not to give hints or suggest what the outcome might be until you've completed the investigation. Now, this is very difficult to do when you have someone in authority or power pressuring you for an answer. But remember, half-baked is simply not edible. And you have to finish the investigation. But at the same time, you have some very public incidents that do require some sort of a response. And sometimes it means you may have to go into overdrive as an investigator. You may have to say, I got to work a little bit overtime. I got to stay on this till I finish. I may not be able to stay within the constraints of my normal workday. The other thing I would suggest is stay away from the press. No comment is the best comment. Merely state that an investigation is ongoing and that due process will be observed. Without stating names, but I have seen many examples of governors and mayors rushing to judgment publicly about an incident, saying this is criminal conduct, that the employees will be fired, only to find out months or several months later that the case turns out totally differently, and they're left with being embarrassed about jumping to conclusions. So there's nothing worse than a public official reaching out, making a conclusion that turns out to be wrong. So one of the best ways to resist this kind of pressure from a supervisor or an authority figure is to say, we don't want to be wrong. We want to get this right. And the best thing you can say, and it's really the most appropriate thing to say, because due process is critical in any investigation. And due process has to be observed. And when you jump to conclusions, you've eliminated due process and you've prejudiced the entire investigation, which is often fatal.
Jeffrey, this has been great. I really appreciate the time you've taken to help prepare this and then to actually execute it. I love the fact that you and I together can reach out to some younger folks these days who are going to carry on the tradition of investigations, hopefully in a very competent way. Thank you so much. Is there anything you want to end up with here?
I would just want to say that I think one of the most important things is you have to do your best to maintain your professionalism. An investigator takes quite a bit of abuse from people. Often people are reluctant or resistant to responding to you. They feel that they're being accused. You have to learn to not be accusatory, but just try to seek the answers, because people are very sensitive and are easily offended. And so you have to be very professional, try to keep your emotions out of it. Try not to tip your hand. It's almost like being a good poker player. You don't want to show them what you're thinking. You want to just focus on them. And remember, don't let them turn the investigation back on you. When you ask a question, a lot of times a witness will say, well, what about you? You know, how do you view this? You're not there to answer their questions. You have to redirect them and keep them on the subject. And to do that, you have to maintain your professionalism, stay objective, and try to keep you cool, because many times a witness will try to get you to react. Your best reaction is no reaction.
Very good. Jeffrey, again, thank you. You have a great day, great weekend. I know Passover's going on right now. Enjoy the holiday, and everyone else, I know Easter, and anyone else who's celebrating anything this weekend, please enjoy that. In any case, guys, it's over with. Thank you, Jeffrey. Take care.
Well, thanks, Anton. It's always good talking to you, and my best to your students. Thanks a lot.
Be good.